want those words we just sang to stick in your mind and heart today, that you leave here today knowing for sure that in your Father's house, there is a place for you. Because that's what we're going to talk about today, is that reminder that it is not about us, it is about Him. It's not about all the good things we bring to the table, how good we are. It's how good He is. How good He is in spite of how good or bad or we are. So there's been an idea as we wrap up this series. There's been this idea, this great quote for Barbara Brown Taylor that I hope's been rattling around in your mind these last few weeks, because it has been for me. This idea that we have made an idol of exhaustion. And I was reminded again of the truth of that in my own life this week. Most Tuesdays I try to have lunch with my youngest son. He works here in the area, and so Tuesdays I try to go. We take him out to lunch. We sit and talk. And so this week we were talking, and he was asking how my week was going, and I had some stuff happen Monday, just out of the ordinary stuff that got me off my schedule. And I'm kind of a schedule guy, and so when I miss what I need to do on Monday, it means it has to get done on Tuesday, which has already got all the stuff that Tuesday has, and Wednesday, and it kind of builds up. And so I was just kind of saying, hey, a little bit behind. I'm trying to catch up. And I love what he said to me. Here, my youngest son says these words to me. Well, Dad, don't you remember what you've been preaching on? Kind of this, I'm exhausted, I'm running, I'm going busy, and I feel good about it, I feel bad about it, and how true. And I'm guessing for some of you it's true as well. That your busyness is more about something deep inside you than it is about just the overwhelmingness of life, as overwhelming as it is. There was a quote I'm going to put up here in just a moment from Abraham Lincoln, which I don't like quoting really old people, dead people, we don't know much about, because it's kind of old. It's kind of a classic preacher tool. We'll go back and use somebody old that nobody remembers except for maybe high school history. But we all are aware of Abraham Lincoln, and he's on More Than the Penny, that the Civil War was happening when this quote happens. And it was at sort of not the height of it, because I can't really say there was a height of the Civil War, but it was just in the heart of it, right? In the midst of it. It didn't appear that things were going well and who was going to win. It was just this terrible, terrible time. And one of his advisors had gotten him alone and had asked him the question and looked at him and said, well, Mr. President, you really need to get some rest. You look terrible. You really need some rest. And this is where these words come in. Well, I don't know about rest. I suppose it's good for the body, but the tired part of me is inside and out of reach. And I thought, what a profound statement for the President of the United States to make at that time, but what also an insight into what's true for so many of us, that it's not just the physical pace of our lives that is the challenge. Sometimes the internal pace, the reasons we push, the reasons we are hard on ourselves, the reasons we try to do more than we should. It comes down to this picture of what we've been singing about this morning and what Kimmy prayed about earlier, about knowing who we are, whose we are. And if we're honest, that's a hard thing to always remember. Because some of us in this space and some of us watching online have had things stuck in our brains, right? These memories. Some of you had really tough parents. Some of you could never be good enough, and so that's what drives you to this day, is that you keep trying to be good enough to prove that they weren't right, and it moves you and it pushes you. For some of you, it's that fear that we've talked about, right? The fear of missing out, of falling behind. But it's also this internal fear that we're just not good enough. And when we try our best and we exceed everything, even that doesn't seem to be good enough. And there's this piece that in all of us that rattles, much like President Lincoln. That the tired part of us is really inside. And it just seems out of our reach. So today we're going to go back to something that Jesus said in the midst of a discussion that he shouldn't have said these words. His discussion was about judgment and how people were missing their opportunity and how Sodom and Gomorrah, these terrible, historic Old Testament places, would have actually had a different story if they had been living in Jesus' day, because he says they had had the same chances as people then had. Things would have been different for them. And then in the midst of that, he will say some words about ways to take advantage of that. But before we get there, let's pray one more time together, okay? Lord, for some of us in this space, some of us online, we know how much we need rest. We know how much we need to slow down. We know how much we need to say no and just to start it, stop, but it is so hard. In fact, sometimes we think we're too far past the start, that to say no or to say stop now is just impossible. And for some of us, the drive in our lives is not the healthiest. It's not just a drive to be the best we can be. It's the drive to prove some people wrong about who we are. But Father, I just ask these words from long ago, these words that your Son said to this small group of people who were gathered around him on that day, would somehow bring the hope and the life that Jesus wanted so much for his people then to know, and I think he wants for us to know now. So use these words to do what only you can do in our lives, because it is out of our reach. And if you can help us to just touch it today and maybe to turn it over to you, this will have been a really, really good day. In your name, amen. So here's the words Jesus says on the midst of this kind of weird situation where, again, he's talking about judgment and how bad things are going to be for people who don't respond. And then he makes this statement about, really the only person that knows me is my Father, and really the only person who knows my Father is me and who I reveal him to. And then Jesus says these words. That's not the words he says, actually. That was the question I was supposed to ask before I said these words. But I got caught up in a moment. So forget everything I just said, put it on pause, remember it in just a moment, and we'll get back to that, all right? But here's the question. How good is good enough? How good is good enough? When we think about in this faith and spirituality, because the words Jesus are going to say, everybody who looks at them says that it's about faith and spirituality. It's not about just physical rest and physical slowdown. It's about this bigger, deeper inside thing. But when you look at your life and we wonder about salvation, what does it mean to be saved? What do I have to do to become saved? How good is good enough? Now, some of us, when we think of that, we think, well, I'm better than him and I'm really better than her. So we feel pretty good about that, but the question isn't about how much better we are than somebody else. It's really about what's the standard, what's the level, what's the expectations to be good? And how good is good enough? Because as good as you are, and some of you are really good, and some of you aren't, let's just be honest, right? But as good as you aren't really sure if you are good enough. Because is good being good all the time for your whole life? Or is it just sort of in this moment of just getting more good stuff on the one side than it is the bad stuff? How good is good enough? Which brings us to all the stuff I said before, which now you're remembering, and here's the words Jesus says, all right? Come to me, all of you who are tired, that is weary, and have heavy loads overburdened. And again, everybody who's looked at this, all the scholars who read this say this is not about just how we deal with life and the busy schedules and all the things that your kids are involved with, all the things you're involved with, all the things you have to do. This is really about a faith issue. And he talks to those people who feel worn down, weary, just overloaded with this faith stuff because that was sort of the culture which they lived. There was always expectations and always could never quite do enough, and it was always about more. Jesus says to those people, and I think he says to us, come to me. Which is kind of ironic because Jesus doesn't just say, drop your load. He says, bring it here. Which means we still have a little bit of peace to do. We have to make that step towards him. But he says, come to me. If you're tired and heavy loads. And he says, I will give you rest. That's the reward for coming to Jesus. And the word rest here is about more than just kind of sitting back and catching your breath. It's really about this idea of rejuvenation. Because all of us in this space have at times rested, but not really rested, right? You know, you sit down, you think, I'm just going to take a break, catch my breath, okay. And you get back up and you feel just a little better, but not really better. But all of us as well have probably had those moments when we've been able to have that break, when we've stepped back, when we've stepped away, we've had to really rest, and we think to ourselves, whew, that was good, right? It's those moments, you know, if you have like a week vacation, it's about on day 5, right? Because on day 6, you're re-engaging, right? And you're thinking back. If you ever get 2 weeks vacation, take 2 weeks vacation. Trust me on this. Because days 5 through like about 10 are wonderful. You get to days 13 and 14, it all comes back, right? We all have this pattern. But it's those moments, and that's what Jesus invites us to, is that if you come, if you got to take that step, bring me your stuff, and I'm going to give you not just rest, but this rest that brings back life. And he goes on. Accept my teachings, that is, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. So this is not just simply come and drop the stuff. This is about an exchange of things. And taking his yoke. And if you're familiar with yokes, how many of you ever seen a yoke? You ought to Google this, right? You may have seen it if you ever traveled up to Pennsylvania and stopped at one of those, you know, farming museums or the little co-ops, right? They got these big wooden things. And you look at those and you think to yourself, that doesn't seem like a really good exchange, right? Because that thing looks heavy. By the way, it is heavy, but it's not designed, it's not about the weight, it's about how it distributes the weight. Because there's normally 2 spots in those yokes. And it's an invitation to come and take Jesus' yoke on you, to walk with him and to move with him. But accept my teachings, learn from me, because I'm gentle and humble in spirit. Jesus says, listen, I'm not all about pushing and struggling and everything. I'm about the care of you. And you will find rest, again, this rejuvenation for your life, for your soul. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But there's one more statement that Jesus makes in this whole idea. The burden that I ask you to accept is easy, and the load, my burden I give you to carry, is light. Which is kind of one of those moronic statements, isn't it? We have an easy burden, and we have a light load. But the truth of the matter is, all of us, either intentionally or subtly, we take on, we link ourselves up with things. We take on yokes, we take on burdens, we take on loads. All of us have them. And we get them lots of places. You got some from your parents. So I go home this afternoon and say, thank you, Mom and Dad, right? You get them from the people around you. You get them from events that happened when you were kids, events that happened during those wonderful middle school and high school years, right? All of our fondness and memories of middle school and high school, aren't they? You pick them up for college years, and if you're old enough, all these other things, you pick up all these pieces, sometimes subconsciously, but we all link ourselves to things. We all carry these loads. We all get piled up more and more and more, and sometimes in the spiritual realm, we pick those things up as well. Because some of you grew up in Christian, I'm going to use quotes, Christian homes. That it wasn't about reminder that you're God's child. It wasn't a reminder that you are good enough in Jesus. It was about all the things you had to do or couldn't do. And for some of you, it was more about all the things you couldn't do, right? You know, you don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't chew, and you don't hang around with girls who do, right? And we don't do this, and we don't do that, and we don't ever eat that, we don't ever drink that, we don't ever listen to that, we don't ever go there, we don't do this. It's all about all these don'ts, and sometimes it seems so overwhelming. There seems like there's never quite enough, that there always, if you do that, there's always a little bit more. I think I've told you this before. Years ago, Lori and I had a small church district out in Utah, a couple small churches. One of them was at what's called a self-supporting school, which is another one of those oxymoronic statements. Because if you've been around, they're not self-supporting. They're always just struggling by, and they barely make it. But it was one of these places that the goal was who could be as good as possible. This was always the question of what's good, right? You got this settled, then you had to have another one. And the big argument when I was there, the big argument was focused on guys. And the question was, which is more holy, a belt or suspenders? And the answer is? Suspenders. No, the answer is, who cares? Suspenders? Are you kidding me? But it was a thing, and literally it divided the group. But it was crazy because it was always about, you got these things settled, and somebody had to come up with something. There always had to be something more that would define who was the most spiritual, who was the goodest of the good there. For some of us, we grew up in those kind of homes, and so that stuff feeds into it, that this is the record that plays. We hear this, but we also always say this one word, the most powerful word in the English language, but, right? We hear this, but hold on, what about that? And if that's true, then what about this? And we build this whole thing up. Because as good as that sounds, there has to be maybe something that calms that down. We forget what the great picture of grace is. That grace is God's extension of his love to people. Not because of, but in spite of what we've done. I'm going to leave that up for just a moment, all right? No, look there. Don't look at me. Look at that. Read that again, all right? Because for some of us, that's not our definition of grace. Our definition of grace is that it's God's extension of his love when we do the best we can. It's God's extension of his love when we are trying our best, that we're doing all the right stuff. Then he kind of throws that other part. It's a partnership. You talked about this yoke, Mike. I'm doing my part. Jesus is doing his part. But what about the yoke? What if the yoke is not just about carrying a heavy load? What if the yoke is about moving in the right direction? Because here's the truth of the matter. Now, you may have some different in spite than I do, but we all got some in spite, right? And all of us need some in spite of grace. In spite of me getting mad this last week at my neighbor, who always seems to let his dog do his business on my yard and never seems to clean it up. In spite of my frustration this week at the office when people didn't do all the things they were supposed to get me the stuff so I could finish my part, and now the boss is breathing down my neck because I'm not getting my part done when I'm relying on all these people. When I yelled at my kids, even though they deserved to be yelled at my kids, I yelled at my kids and I raised maybe too much energy, too much anger in that moment. That when I did that again, when I thought that again, when I said that again. When that thing that's so deep within inside me that needs so much rest, I either pushed it farther back, or I just kind of didn't want to deal with it, or I looked at it again and said, it's out of my reach. That all of us need. God's in spite of grace. And that kind of grace is not earned. It is simply offered. And that's the part that religiously has tripped up Christians for thousands of years. Because that is too good. Because I have to have some part in me, because some ways my parents told me, if it's too good to be true, and that sounds too good to be true. How could God step in? How could God do this stuff for me without me doing something in return? So much of our lives are centered around earning. You may have had an allowance at your house. How many of you had an allowance that you actually had to work for? All right. How many of you just had an allowance because you just simply existed? You were the kids we all hated, but that was a better picture of God's grace than we got. You go to school. We have lovely teachers in our congregation, right? We appreciate you so much. We're glad somebody can stand our kids for that many hours a day. Not all of our kids. No, we're honest about it. I mean, I respect, I know you guys do more than just work in the classroom. I know some of you just work, it's like all the time. Sundays, you're catching up, and every night. It's an incredible gift that you give to us. But you are also part of this problem. Because whether you grade on the curve, you're one of those lovely teachers that I always loved who would only give so many A's. Only so many people could get A's in their class. Even if you have a simple pass-fail, you have helped contribute to all of our mindset, our corporate mindset that says we have to earn something. The only way to pass is for me to do something so I can pass. Otherwise, I have failed. And I understand that's how you have to have a system that works. And I'm not belittling you for having a system, because I don't want somebody who's flunked out of med school operating on me, okay? For me, grace stops at a certain place. So I understand we have this structure, but the problem is that structure, our life's experiences about how things work, then contribute to how we have our faith experience and how it works. And that is such a hard thing for us to grasp. Because we've spent our whole life learning this one way, that you get out of it what you put into it. That if you work hard, maybe there's a shot. That the only way to get ahead is to hustle. We have all these kinds of things, and then all of a sudden we come, and this whole idea of grace, that it's simply offered. But there's a reason that it's simply offered. It's because God's grace has no boundaries, it has no measure, and it has no limits. And it all comes back to that question of how good is good enough. And the answer is better than you and better than me. And if it's better than all of us, we are all screwed. And I use that word intentionally. One is I couldn't think of another word to fit in there. But for me, that word carries this sort of, it's at the edge of how we talk. But it's a great picture of where we're at. Because if it's up to us, we are in deep trouble. Somebody tagged me on their Facebook this week with this quote, and I thought it was such a great reminder that sometimes having limitations is a holy thing. In fact, Paul will write at length about this. Paul, the guy who wrote the majority of this thing we call the New Testament, part of our Bible, he wrote in a section called Romans. If you want to go look at it, read chapters 3, chapter 7, and chapter 8, but actually you can read much more than that. But in those ones, he captures this whole idea that our limitations are actually a good thing. They're a holy thing because they remind us again that it is not up to us, that we can't because we can't, that he can because he can. There are times we get those runs where we feel like we're just flying spiritually, that faithfully things are going well. We're not doing, everything's good. We are getting to a really good spot, a really good rhythm. We forget our limitations. And then sometimes something happens and we revert back to what happened before, or something new happens and we get angry, or we get frustrated, or we say something, or we do something. And then we feel terrible. We feel terrible about doing it, but also then about what that means, that maybe I'm not as far along as I want it to be. There's a statement I read years ago that pops up at moments like this. And the statement simply says something like this: that we will often have to fall down at the feet of Jesus. That we will often find ourselves having limitations. That we'll often find ourselves failing him, sometimes miserably. So we will fall down in front of him, asking for forgiveness, asking for some way this could change, some place that this would not happen again. And for some of us, that's a cycle that happens over and over. And for some of us, it's that moment that brings freedom. Can't explain why those things don't always happen the same way, but oftentimes, we'll have to fall at the feet of Jesus. But that's not where the statement ends. It goes on to say, but in that moment, we are not cast off. We are not thrown away. We are not forsaken. And the reason is, it's because God loves us. And the crazy thing is not only does God love us, God actually likes us. Which I'm glad when Jesus said, this is my new command, that you love one another. He didn't say we had to like one another. Because that's a whole different thing, right? Let's just be honest. I'm thankful he didn't put those two things together. But God not only loves you, he likes you. Which for some of you, I'm going to look up here because I'm not accused of looking at anybody. For some of you, that is an incredible statement. But it's a true statement. And that's why in those moments of our limitations, a holy thing can happen. Because we then come into the presence of a holy God who has said that you're good enough. Because you're good enough is based on his in spite of grace. Not because of what you bring to the table. Not because of your goodness. Not because you always do all the right things. And that's not to say those things aren't important. It's just to say those things aren't important when it comes to how God looks at you, how God responds to you, how God loves you. So with that said, let me give you just a few things to think about. First of all, whose load are you carrying? And maybe this is one of those things that maybe today is the day that you kind of recognize, yeah, I'm carrying somebody else's load that was given to me a long time ago. And maybe the healthiest thing you can do as you leave this place is this next week to make an appointment to go see a counselor. I'm thankful we're getting better, but we're still not quite there yet. on how we treat mental health. You know, we treat physical health so much different than we do mental health, don't we? If somebody's sick, you take them to the hospital, right? If you need some medication to get through this flu, or you got some infection, we give you something, right? Sometimes our emotional and mental health, we think, oh, no, I ought to be able to just pray this away. Just need to have more faith. Maybe the faith you need to have is that you need help. And that maybe God can use somebody else to help lessen this load. And if you're carrying somebody else's load, how is that working for you? Which I think is a great question. I actually learned this question from a lady who used to be a member of mine years ago. And she'd come from a really terrible upbringing and a lot of addiction, a lot of struggles. But she had this great way of bringing it down to the point. And so she'd say, this is how you're dealing with stuff. Well, how's that working for you? Because if it's not working so good, maybe you ought to try a different way of working about things, right? So as you look at that load and look at that offer, Jesus says to drop that load and drop that burden for a different kind of burden, different kind of load. You need to ask yourself how it's working in your current situation. And what would come to Jesus? What would that look like in your life? Because Jesus doesn't explain what coming to him looks like, other than coming and learning and getting this yoke on. But what does that look like? What would that look like in your life? And lastly, what would it mean to stop, to rest, to yoke up with Jesus? Because I'm convinced, whether it's true in your life or not, it is true in my life. That I need to figure out how to start with stop as opposed to working towards stop. And while Sabbath is this great way to experience it, it is not the only way to experience it. There's something about pace of life. There's something about this thing, as Abraham Lincoln so clearly pointed out, that's within all of us. That we just need rest from, and that always seems out of reach, but maybe it's not out of reach. Maybe it's not out of reach if we'll learn to stop and to rest and to yoke up with Jesus.